sauti ya waajiri wetu, tunasherekea uhusiano wetu, washirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu, tunasherekea uhusiano wetu, washirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu, tunasherekea uhusiano wetu, washirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. Za upendo za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu, tunafurahia miaka za upendo za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu, tunafurahia miaka za upendo za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu, tunafurahia miaka za upendo za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. 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 Tunasherekea uhusiano wetu, washirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherekea uhusiano wetu, washirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherekea uhusiano wetu, washirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherekea uhusiano wetu, washirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. za upendo, za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunafurahia miaka za upendo, za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunafurahia miaka za upendo, za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunafurahia miaka za upendo, za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. 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 Tunasherehekea uhusiano wetu, mashirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherehekea uhusiano wetu, mashirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherehekea uhusiano wetu, mashirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherehekea uhusiano wetu, mashirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. Miaka za upendo, za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunafurahia miaka za upendo, za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunafurahia miaka za upendo, za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunafurahia miaka za upendo, za maendeleo, shirika la wafanyikazi wetu. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. Tunasema asante waajiriwa, asante wanachama, asante washirika, asante. Tunasema asante waajiriwa,
Gentlemen, my name is Eric Munyobi. I think I've interacted with nearly all of you in the run-up to this webinar. This is our masterclass series, which we began last year, and we are at it again in the support of industry. Today, we shall have a full house with our CEO, who is going to join us shortly and open the session, which will run for 2 hours. We shall end at 12 noon. Drop your questions on the chat box as well as the Q&A, because at the end, we shall have a session dedicated to responding to all the questions you have raised. It could be a question, it could be a comment. Please feel encouraged to drop it there. And if you have a challenge with your audio or anything, just drop a message and we'll try and settle it from our end. But sometimes the challenge could also be on your end. So check your settings on your laptop or the device you are using. So with those few remarks, I would like to invite our Executive Director, Mrs. Jacqueline Mugo, who is going to give us her brief remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to welcome all of you to this virtual masterclass series for 2021. This is the first one we are organizing this year. But we have lined up a series of enriched monthly masterclasses which seek to serve you virtually and in a cost-effective manner. The reason why we put together these masterclasses is to help build your capacity as employers to cope with what we're all calling the new normal, and also to address the emerging challenges and be aware of the trends, specifically in the labor relations and the legal field, so that we can address them in a timely way and be able to remain productive. So today we start the masterclass on emerging issues in labor relations, regulations, and legal instruments. This has been a very active area in our view as we have assessed what's been happening since COVID descended on us last year in March. So this masterclass is divided into 3 modules. The one we're looking at today, module 1, is the evolving nature of industrial relations, which will be done today by a very able team of experts whom I'll be introducing shortly. Module 2 will be done tomorrow, and it will look at the impact of COVID-19 on workplaces. And we will conclude with module 3 on Thursday, the 25th of March, on the topic significant trends in collective bargaining, which is also another area where we are seeing a lot of activity and issues. I think we're all aware that the pandemic is far from over. If anything, we're in the 3rd wave, which is taking a toll on the community, including workplaces. I think by now we all know somebody or have lost a loved one, lost a friend, lost a relative, and this 3rd wave is unrelenting. So we have to continue coexisting with the pandemic. And as employers, we need to be aware of the developments in the employment landscape so that we can choose consciously where to focus our energy and our resources, because resources are limited and the demands are many. So what we're asking this year is, what can employers expect for this year, 2021 and beyond? One of the things we are seeing is a prediction that there'll be a global upswing in trade union activity. This is global. Even here in Kenya, it is happening because this year the unions have the elections. So enterprises, even enterprises that don't have unions, need to improve the employee engagement by identifying the needs of their employees, by evaluating their human resource policies and procedures, and building a strong corporate culture with effective employee feedback systems so that you can know the interventions that your employees need to remain focused on delivery on the job. The other area is innovation. Innovation in how we work, just changing how we work to address the new situation. This demand for innovation remains key this year. So companies Employers will need to put emphasis on fostering creativity and innovation, creating the right culture in which employees can be creative, can suggest ideas on how to do things differently, and having a culture that accepts that and appreciates input of the employees. We will, as a federation, continue to advocate for best practice human resource solutions and also look together with you at how we can intervene in these processes, how we can support enterprises to remain afloat and to save jobs, because job losses continues to be a reality. As business leaders, we all know that we have been thrown into a crisis with the pandemic, and that the situation changes frequently and every day. In fact, we know that tomorrow will not be the same as yesterday, and the day after will not be the same as well. So how do we cooperate with this fast changing landscape? These master classes will help us keep abreast of these rapid changes and also give us an opportunity to share ideas as employers, as business leaders, as managers of people. We believe, as a team at FKA here, that all of you delegates who have joined this course will benefit. Our only appeal to you is that you please implement all the learnings. Please ask questions if you have them, post them, as Erica said, in the chat box. Let me now take a few minutes to introduce our team of facilitators. They are all from the Federation of Kenya Employers, people who grapple with these issues on a daily basis. They are led by George Masese, who is our acting head of legal and industrial relations. With him is Dickens Ouma, who is a senior legal officer here at FKE. We also have Grace Kaome, who is a human resource and admin manager. We have Moses Ombok, who is a senior industrial relations officer here at FKE, and Joseph Nyaga, who is our industrial relations officer. He joined us recently, and we're very happy to have him. And finally is Eric, whom you have already met, who is a manager in charge of FKE consulting and training. A great team that I hope you'll interact with. And with these few remarks, it is now my pleasure and privilege to officially open this Masterclass 2011. I wish you all an enjoyable and interactive session, not just today, but for the next 3 days, as we look at the topic on emerging issues in labor relations, regulations, and legal instruments. Karibuni sana, and have a great time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Edie, for those wonderful remarks. So we are going to get started, and our first session this morning will be conducted by our acting head of legal and industrial relations, Mr. George Masese. They will actually co-share this session with our senior legal officer, Mr. Dickens Ouma, and they are ready to go. Over to you, George.
Good morning, delegates. Allow me to remove my mask. I may not be comfortable addressing when the mask is on. Welcome once again to this module, looking at the emerging issues in labor relations, regulations, and legal instruments. Today, I'm going to co-share this presentation with my colleague, Dickens Ouma, who is also assistant industrial relations expert at the Federation of Kenya Employers. So basically, I will present what I feel I have good information, which I can share with you, and then the rest of the slides will be shared by my colleague, Dickens. So without wasting time, maybe we can start with what are the learning objectives of, of this training today? Basically, is to equip you participants with the right knowledge of on how to navigate the industrial relations issues during the COVID-19 pandemic, and also at the same time appreciate the changing dynamics of social dialogue, which Mr. Ouma will speak on, specifically on social dialogue, and the impact it has had in containing our businesses. Also, we need to identify the emerging regulatory and legal tools or instruments that have impacted on industrial relations under the prevailing circumstances of COVID-19. So we are going to focus our presentation on 3 or 4 areas. We are going to look at the definition and the actors in the industrial relations, and then we are going to look at the system, the IR system in Kenya, and then what have been the recent changes that have happened actually to the industrial relations system in Kenya. And then my colleague, as I've said, is going to talk on social dialogue and how it has impacted in containing the pandemic, or rather maintaining our businesses to continue with less disruption in terms of maybe industrial actions and all that. Then we look at the impact of COVID-19 on specifically industrial relations, where we look at the impact it has had on the processes and also the outcomes on industrial relations. Can move the next one. Then my colleague again is going to look at the MOU. Of course, try to unpack that MOU, demystify some of the issues that we have seen, of course, running up and down in the newspapers, and of course, amongst ourselves as employers. What is it that we have not understood properly about this MOU? Or are we implementing this MOU the right way? Or are we making, are we taking advantage of maybe a lack of information on the part of the employees and maybe the unions to implement the MOU in a manner that maybe does not promote the social dialogue? And also then we look at one of the actors in industrial relations is the Employment and Labor Relations Court. Then we are going to look at the case laws that are coming from this industrial court, or the Employment and Labor Relations Court. What impact do they have? Are they consistent? And if they are not consistent, have they had an impact in industrial relations in Kenya? And to what extent do they impact on our decision-making at workplaces involving employers and employees? As part of the introduction, I can say that basically all around the world, all employers have been messed up. They've faced a lot of challenges coming out of this pandemic. Social distancing has led to few employees being at work and all that. So as we're trying to emerge out of this pandemic, of course, from the various regulations and the containment measures, shutdowns and all that, the World Health Organization again has come up again and said, look, you are not yet out of it. Now the third wave is here. And the third wave is actually sending more negative signals to employers who are actually thinking that they have now come out of this pandemic. Not yet. We are not yet to a situation whereby we can say our industrial relations now is very stable the way it used to be, and therefore now we can go back to our normal way of carrying out our businesses and managing our people the same way. Next one. In the Kenyan context, what is it, how does this IR impact? And basically for those, there are those new in the field of industrial relations, and of course, we have participants who have been in this field for quite some time, and they understand what industrial relations is. But for purposes of those new practitioners, or those who have entered into this field of industrial relations for the first time, I think it's better that we start from what is it that we call industrial relations. In the narrow sense is that industrial relations is about relationship between employers and employees and unions at that level. But then we look at it like, what is the best definition that encompasses or really brings out what industrial relations is as a whole? Then we say industrial relations refers to all types of relations between employers and workers, be they at national, regional, or company level. And all dealings with social and economic issues, for example, wage settings, working time, and working conditions. You saw the MOU that was signed. It was signed between the Federal Kenya Employers, COTU, and also the national government. That is now industrial relations. And you could see, as we are going to see, we have seen many enterprises coming up with enterprise agreements, of course, out of being guided by the MOU. Again, that is now another level, another layer of industrial relations. Now, in this, there are three main actors, and this basically for the new entrants into this field of industrial relations. We have the government, we have the employers, and the unions. These are the traditional players in industrial relations. Of course, of late, we have seen other actors trying to come into the field of industrial relations. We have seen the NGOs trying to come into the aspect of industrial relations. We have also now, it's high time now that we included the Employment and Labor Relations Court as a key actor actually in the field of industrial relations. So before the COVID-19 came in, we saw that the industrial relations in Kenya was a little bit calm. That's what we can say. And there was no much running up and down. The resolution of disputes was a little bit predictable. Move the next slide. Was predictable, and it was organized. And that is basically what was there before this COVID came in. And so if we try to look at that context, then we better look also at what system do we have of industrial relations in Kenya. Of course, we have 3 or 4 different systems. The last one, I think, was coined very recently by an expert from Harvard University. But the traditional ones, of course, there are three systems of industrial relations. So in Kenya, we basically have the pluralistic kind of a system of industrial relations, whereby we respect the legitimacy of the unions to represent employees at workplaces, and of course, the management being acting as a mediator in some of the disputes, and also building concessions. It's actually a democracy where we have a process of where we say we have to build concessions and own processes as we move forward. And that is how the Kenyan system works. It's a system that really appreciates the owners of capital making decisions, but they must consult the working class as they move along. So we look at the new normal impacting on the IR or the industrial relations in Kenya. We have seen actually the new normal introducing, other actors into the industrial relations, and that every decision the employer is making, for example, the working hours, how many employees are coming to work, now it is determined by the Ministry of Health regulations. So we have seen during this period that the Ministry of Health, actually with the regulations and the act, the Public Health Act, it has an impact, or it has impacted on the industrial relations in Kenya, and you can see it has become disruptive in nature. And some of the examples that we can see is how the unions, for example, in the sexual service industry, how they have approached the government in terms of trying to resolve their disputes. And we have seen a situation where the government has moved in and said, look, we are not going to collect union dues on your behalf. Of course, we know this is in the law, that as an employer, including the government as an employer, that you must collect, you are an agent of the unions anyway. So collect the union dues and give them to the union. But for purposes of disrupting the union or weakening the union, we have seen the government moving in and saying we are not going to do this. And of course, in other sectors of the public sector, we have seen a lot of disruption and there's unpredictability on how we handle these industrial relations issues. We have seen continuous update of policies at workplaces. We have seen change of instructions. We have seen new rules coming in. For example, if you go to Mombasa, you have sent your employees to Mombasa, or you have sent your employees, let's say, out of the country. And then all of a sudden you're told there's a new upsurge of COVID-19 in that area. And then some containment measures have been put in by the government, or maybe a scare by the media. Then you see an employer changing instructions midway. Stop what you're doing, come back to Nairobi, or stop what you're doing, go back home and take 2 weeks off as you go for a checkup, because you are from an area that maybe we suspect somebody might have been infected with the virus. So it's very unpredictable how employers are managing their employees in the new normal. And of course, the kind of policies that we have brought on the table. Every action that we take now, it requires that you must have a policy guideline. For example, when you talk of managing employees who are working from home, how far do we extend industrial relations to people who are working at all? And then the only way you can do that is through a policy framework that you should have, which means you can now manage people working from home, and of course, involving the unions in employees working from home in the event of a misconduct, and you want to take a disciplinary action. So that is how far this has affected actually the industrial relations practice in this country. And the employer now must also be ready to change with the new changes, because they say one thing that is very certain is change. Change is never static. Change keeps on changing. Of course, we have seen the areas that are more affected when it comes to managing industrial relations. And these are areas of working hours. We have seen increase in flex time. And when you see the working hours affected in terms of increase of flex time, then of course, there's something that I've mentioned down there called the gig economy, which is now again in the market. We have seen the introduction of the gig economy because, of course, most employees are working from home. The technology, they are free, they can do a lot. So you find like one employee can work for actually 2 or 3 employees without actually even knowing. And then we have seen what the trade unions are doing. This pandemic, for example, if you read the news the other day, where in UK, the Uber employees or Uber operators who went to court and won a case that they're actually employees of Uber. Immediately, the Secretary General of COTU issued a statement, and it was a strongly worded statement into the labor market, saying that all those Safaricom agents are now supposed to be regarded as employees of Safaricom. So what does that mean as we move forward? It means that a lot of things are going to change for employers. And looking at the outsourcing kind of business, what future do we have with it, with the way the unions are now moving in, actually to make sure that they stop employers from applying certain tools to manage their businesses. Then we have seen a significant effect on gender. We have seen, and this is actually very well documented, that female employees have actually been affected so much during this period. And what is it? What is the learning point for employers? For employers, the learning point is that we must now be able to balance and include gender in our decision making. In that one gender does not feel, or they don't start feeling like they have been left out because of the pandemic, and then they are taken to be vulnerable. Of course, the breastfeeding mothers and those old age employees, of course, they are vulnerable. But then in terms of how we are going to make decisions, it's very key that we don't find ourselves being taken to court, maybe, or a dispute being raised because of contravention of Section 5 of the Employment Act, where they're saying there's discrimination in terms of how you're allocating duties, and therefore during this period, only male, majority are the ones actually who are being given these jobs. But remember again, the statistics is that male employees are the worst affected by this pandemic than the female. So again, for decision-making purposes, that is something that again we should take into consideration. Demographic, of course, when it comes to the government directives, it has affected most employers. You cannot now allow employees more than 50 years old to your workplace. And if you do that, then you must put in measures to protect them because they are saying they are vulnerable. What does that mean to employers? Many decisions are being made around this demographic. One, the first decision is, do I retire these people? But you don't have a policy on retirement. Of course, we are going to see in another area where we have seen early retirements affecting these employees without, again, affecting succession planning at workplaces. So these are some of the things that are being affected, and we need to discuss as employers and agree what should be the best way and how do we set the agenda so that we don't wait for the unions to set for us the agenda, but we set the agenda ourselves and drive the business. Then we see that at workplaces, there's reduction of welfare activities. Most companies now are not able to afford their welfare initiatives that employees were enjoying. For example, the unions all over the world, and more so in Kenya, they have told the government, you must cut expenditure in your offices. And this actually goes back to the private sector also, that we are cutting expenditure at workplaces. We are not providing all the goodies that we used to give our employees for purposes of course, motivating them to come to work. And we have seen many retirements during this period, and this has affected actually succession planning. We were making use of those employees who are beyond retirement age, of course, who are at work, and we didn't have a plan or maybe succession plan for them. But during the pandemic, employers were faced with the option of doing a redundancy and an option of a retirement. Then a redundancy, sometimes it became a little bit expensive because the unions had entered into some agreements with some of the employers and saying, don't declare redundancy, but we can have flex time, we can have rotational basis and all that. So then employers resorted to retirement. What happened? What happened in the industrial relations is that there was no plan for that succession, for the exit of those employees who had actually reached retirement age, but they were working. So it meant that now we were left with employees who didn't have the experience that those old people that we had retired, of course, we were depending on them, had. And therefore, was there a time for them to pass over this information or this kind of skills to the other employees? No, there wasn't time. So it caught employers unaware, but they had to make a decision. Looking at the CBAs, what has happened in the line of CBAs? Sorry, we have seen centralization of CBAs and also decentralization at the same time. So these things have been moving up and down. Centralization of the CBA is where you find employers are now actually moving in to join larger organization associations or groups, and also now be protected under that umbrella for them to be able to have a higher bargaining power or a higher bargaining or negotiations skills through the associations. Then we have seen also decentralization. We have seen employers moving from groups, or they are moving from associations, and they're saying, let's go to enterprise level and try to negotiate the CBAs on our own. And but the number of decentralization has actually been very high, because most employers are saying we cannot manage actually to sustain our business by basing the wages on the group CBA. Now, what does this what does this mean to businesses, or what has been the way out of it? Decentralization, the way it has happened is that we have had again more agreements being made. Of course, some clauses being crafted to allow those employers who are not able to maintain their businesses through the group CBA or association CBA to actually go and negotiate on their own with the unions. With the government, you saw what happened in the essential service industry. There was push and pull, because you saw the Ministry of Health was saying they want to resolve the dispute regarding the health workers. But then we are saying this health issue is a devolved part of devolved units. So the county governments were actually the ones who were supposed to come in and resolve this dispute. But who was giving instructions? The one who was giving instructions was the Ministry of Health, and the county government was not giving instructions. Actually, they went back and they applied divide and rule on the unions. You saw Kiambu, they could actually enter into an agreement. Then the Secretary General of a union like Kenan could find himself in Nairobi issuing a completely different statement, reading riot acts to his branch officials. And you see now, the question was, these people want to earn a living, and they have gotten a good way out. So then the government here is saying, look, the Kenan is saying, look, I'm the only one who can get you out of this. So the government was trying to centralize this aspect, but legally, there was no way it was going to centralize, because this is something that is left to the county governments. The other issue that we saw in the year 2020, and which was of course automatic, was the freeze on minimum wage. And the last time we had the increase was 2018, so which was gazetted in 2019 January, of course dating back to 2018. Then, if you look at the government's regulations on the duration of CBAs, we expected maybe in the year 2020 the government could have said we want to increase. But of course, as usual, the government came in with, of course, goodies to the employees to push on them against this pandemic, effects of the pandemic, and therefore there was a freeze on the minimum wage, and the unions have not talked about it. We saw employees earning below the minimum wage, and the union was not complaining. Of course, in one of the negotiations that we had, some unions actually were threatening employers, and this was all over the place. That we cannot allow our employees to earn below the minimum. We were saying, okay, fine, if that's the case, then they can go home and relax, because they are not working, they can't earn a living, and that is it. So the unions started seeing the sense, of course, in as much as they were fighting the MOU in one or another, they saw the sense that, look, we have to allow employers, just put it there. We have to allow employers and of course, manage their business. I saw room given to the employers to govern or to manage their businesses. One important thing that actually happened during this period, again, which I want to share with you, is that for the first time, employers had a leeway to make decisions, certain decisions, without even consulting the unions. And the unions didn't have a problem with it. Why? Because the pandemic came with its own regulations. And that is the only time that employers were able to make certain decisions, we call them unilateral decisions, without consulting employers and unions. And then that is it. So looking at the public sector, of course, we have seen SRC and the Essential Service, of course, with their own issues. How has it affected the industrial relations? One, now some unions have copied from what essential service industry and SRC issues. They have copied, and now they are now translating to private sector. What they are saying, they want wage increments. And you see the kind of wage increment they're asking right now. They're asking wage increments beyond maybe 10%, others asking for 15%. And remember, we are asking this during a period that the employer is feeling now the effect of COVID-19 now, and not during that, not during that time. So this is the time now they are copying from the SRC and Essential Service and saying, you saw what is happening in the public sector. I mean, they are adding salaries. The government is adding salaries to unions and giving allowances. So what we also demanding the same thing. Then we saw in the private sector, of course, doing away with some of the allowances. And you saw yesterday what was happening in the media. SRC saying we want to scrap some of the allowances. But the way it is done in a way that basically it is very unilateral, because I've not seen a situation where they are consulting with the public service unions and making a decision going forward. So they are making unilateral decisions. They may be acceptable during this period because of the pandemic. Next. Now, I want to invite my colleague, Dickens Oma, to take us through this social dialogue aspect, and then I'll come in later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, delegates. Just allow me to remove my mask. Of course, we are keeping social distance here of nearly 2 meters from each other. But I just want to share with you something that is not very novel. That is the aspect of social dialogue. Of course, at the workplace and in respect to the relationship between the employer and the workers, this is very key. If you look at the substantive aspects of the Industrial Relations Charter, and you look at the substance of the employment law, the Employment Act, as well as the Labor Relations Act, the thread that runs through it is on social dialogue. Why? Because employer-employee relationship is a social relationship. It is social because when there are disputes, then you must have noticed that there's a lot of emotions that run through it. You know, people put in their best. The employer is in it as an enterprise driver. The employee is there with the skills, but there is a livelihood that comes out of it and the social dynamics that come with it, because the employee, there are people that are looking upon the employee, you know, the family members, the community, and even the social fabric of the entire nation. It revolves around the employee and employer in equal measure. So social dialogue is the cornerstone of industrial relations at the workplace. If there is a breakdown in social dialogue, then you and I know that nothing will move. But the period that encompasses the last 1 year, particularly during the pandemic period, the aspect of social dialogue has become very crucial. In fact, there is no any other time that this has become very important as it was in 2020 and in 2021 going forward. Exchange of information became very crucial. I mean, we had to share information. We had to work together. And this was the only way negotiations and consultation would be achieved. That is part and parcel of social dialogue. You know, there were instances where employers organization and business membership organization had to reach out to the various stakeholders so that we forge a common front and chart the way forward. You know, the workers and unions, most importantly, had to embrace social dialogue. And it was simple, you know. The pandemic came in, came with a bang. And the message that went out clearly was that if you do not sit down and talk about your issues, then you'll either hang together or you'll hang separately. And even with the collective bargaining agreements, this is the time that sanity had to prevail and people had to come to the negotiating table and, chart the way forward and look at the instruments of engagement and have them reviewed through mutual discussions. It would be important to also look at social dialogue as a navigation tool during the pandemic period. And this was best demonstrated in April 2020 when the national tripartite partners actually came together to find a way forward. And this is how the MOU, which I will talk about later on, came to be. And if you look at the MOU, as I will explain later on, the central point that it embraces and which it encourages the stakeholders to look at is on consultations between the unions and employers. This was very critical because the pandemic was unexpected. It came as a surprise, but most importantly, it brought to fore the need to consult before action would be taken on going forward. We also saw the birth of enterprise level agreements. This is the various sectors, had to look at their unique circumstances so that they are able to chart an amicable way of moving forward in the midst of this pandemic. Of course, there's several instances where our social partners, particularly the unions, felt that there was no proper consultation. But this was understandable because the various stakeholders were looking at the circumstances from their unique perspectives without necessarily appreciating the other side. Employers probably were in a panic to save businesses. Employees, on the other hand, were in a panic because they were seeing job losses right at their faces. But you realize that as time went and within the shortest time possible, all the stakeholders realized that it didn't have to be doomed. As long as the stakeholders were able to sit down and chart the way forward, there could be job security as well as saving the businesses from collapse. Let me go to the next. So for the first time in a very long time, the relationship between the parties, the tripartite parties, became very important, and it was appreciated by the stakeholders. I think I'm sure I would not be wrong to say that the relationship between the social partners generally improved, because we were seeing doom on the face of it. And both sides reckoned that if we don't talk, if we do not agree, then we are all doomed. At the national level, of course, we had the relationship between FKE and COTU greatly improved more often than not during the pandemic. We were talking the same language because we had a common issue that we had to talk about and find a way forward and give leadership to. You looked at the collective bargaining agreements that were there, the issues of wage freezes, which were unthinkable before, now came to the fore, and they had to be talked about, because you don't talk about it, a lot of things would scatter. Things like pay cuts, which hitherto were unthinkable or were never subject of negotiations, became prime issues to interrogate and see their efficacies. Working on a rotational basis, issues that were never thought about, now came to the fore, and they had to be confronted, at the negotiation table. Short-term contracts, it was always seen as a form of contractual engagement, but this time it came in handy because nobody knew how long the pandemic was going to be. So in short, we had to start coming to terms with the new normal. You see, there was a reconciliation of the competing interest, particularly the social partners. Now, these competing interests had to be put into focus so that a common understanding and charting the way forward. And the long and short of it is that it helped to build trust and ownership of policies that were put in place to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. And building of that trust was very important. Ownership of those policies was very important going forward, so that on the employee side, they felt part and parcel of decision-making, arriving at that common understanding. On the employer's aspect, they had to now appreciate the aspect of human resource as a factor of production and in helping to, make policies going forward. Now, when it comes to the aspect of industrial relations processes, the impact of industrial relations processes, this is Mr. Masese's forte. I believe he would articulate this better than I would, because I've learned a lot from him. He was involved in this process. If you remember last year when we were having our webinars, he really centralized on this area, and I really would want him to have a look at it for all our benefit. Thank you very much. I'll be with you shortly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dickens, for that discussion. Basically, what impacts on the early processes is, of course, on the aspect of information exchange, which we are saying that it is the level at which employers and employees have had to exchange information during this period has been very high, by the way, than before. Previously, employers were not willing really to exchange certain information. Because the union, during that period when we had a very calm kind of industrial relations, the unions were not willing really to listen. But during this period, I think we've been able to talk to the unions have been able to listen, and the rate of exchange of information has been very high. But to digress from that, when you look at the collective industrial action, a major issue that happened actually during this period. And I think this is going forward. We don't expect it again, maybe to go to other sectors of the private sector, where we have two unions in the same, under the same employer. For example, you find Kenya Commercial Food and Allied Workers Union. You also find Kenya Plantation and Allied Workers Union under the same employer. For the government, what happened was there was a merger of unions. If you saw what happened during this period of COVID-19, there was a merger of unions where all the unions in the essential service, not essential service, but health sector, they actually issued a strike notice. One strike notice. Of course, when you issue a strike notice, we know that each and every union has its own recognition with the employer, and that recognition has its own mechanism of how to resolve disputes. But this time around, all the unions, clinicians, Canaan, KB, MDU, they issued one statement, which all the Secretary Generals signed actually on one letter to the government. What happened was, when we went for the resolution of that dispute, actually there's a formation of the multi-agency committee. We were unable to separate them because they were saying we want all our issues addressed now, and the government, of course, was so much willing to listen to doctors and not nurses and the clinicians, and the first, of course, MOU they wanted to sign with the doctors and not nurses and all that. And of course, it brought a lot of issues. So we saw that merge of unions during this period of the pandemic in terms of the industrial action processes, taking which now prolonged the resolution of that dispute. If you saw the doctors got out of it, we had to remain with the nurses, and the government now was exhausted. They were saying, let's wait a bit and see what happens. They were now trying to force employees, of course, to go back to work, using all manner of techniques to have these guys go back to work. Now, when it comes to industrial dispute resolution, of course, we saw the formation of a multi-agency committee by the Ministry of Labor. This was the first time I think they were forming the multi-agency committee. We usually have a committee that is appointed by the minister to oversee maybe a resolution of a certain dispute. But this time around, it was a multi-agency committee of the Ministry of Health. Now, was it effective or not effective? The analysis, it's too early maybe to analyze whether that multi-agency is the best way to resolve a dispute or not. But my assessment, my previous assessment, and the short period I attended those meetings, is that when you have a multi-agency committee, one, you are not able to select people who are actually trained to resolve these disputes. That is one. Secondly, a large number of these employees or of these people who come to that multi-agency committee, they have different views. So it takes a lot of time. By the time we settle on a certain dispute, that may be on a certain item, that is the way we want it to be settled, it takes almost 3 days. And then the other thing is that multi-agency, sometimes we assume and bring multi-agency at an early stage. For example, you should know at what time do you bring in the Attorney General for a dispute in industrial relations, because for them it's about legal, protect the government, constitution. You bring in SRC is about our mandate is to do this. So when you bring in these people from the first time, like what happened during that period, it actually, people came not to resolve the dispute, but to state positions of where they're coming from. So basically the doctors and the nurses, we took a lot of time to discuss positions of SRC, the position of Attorney General in that meeting, and their constitutional mandate and all that. Of course, again, somebody was trying to ask like, how does FK come in? How does COTU come in and all that? So those are people outside, of course, the practice of industrial relations. That took a lot of time. So again, it's a learning point going forward that formation of multi-agency committees, then we must rework it in a way that can resolve that dispute other than really resolving the stating positions of people who have come to that meeting. There's a very big departure, which happened actually in Mombasa. We saw a magistrate court giving orders. Why? Because according to the CJ, the Chief Justice practice rules, those employees who are earning less than 80,000 shillings, their cases should be handled by the magistrate courts. Now, when it comes to items to deal with employee relations, how does the magistrates come in? And to what extent can they now give certain orders in a collective action? So these employees who went to court, the magistrate gave orders and told the employer, you cannot effect deduction of salaries. And of course, despite the fact that the employer had consulted with these employees and they had actually, some of them had actually even accepted. So this aspect of the magistrate court coming in and entering into the business of industrial relations, is this a trend that we are going to see going forward? And if that is the case, do they have the capacity to do that? If they don't have the capacity and if that's not the way, how do employers come in and stop these magistrate courts from presiding over certain issues that they may not have jurisdiction, expertise, and they don't have the support of the employment and labor relations structures? Then, of course, I've talked about centralization and decentralization of employers. Of course, looking at the county governments, the national governments, and associations, groups of the federation. One key point I want to point out is that in the last 1 year, we have seen a large number of employers joining the federation. And their question has been always, how do we move forward now that we have the union that has come to actually recruit? Why? Because during this period, again, most employees actually ran to unions because they were feeling like there's protection in the unions. Wherever there's a discussion on rotational basis, a union comes in and says, we can help you. So when they do that, they run to the unions. So the union, if you look at the union, can I call it the union density? It went high. Then this translated to these employers now coming to the federation. And of course, we were able to help them, and some of them were very satisfied. And the unions, of course, sometimes the unions also like working from the federation. I think this is something that you should know. They like working from here because we tell them exactly how it is, and we exchange information openly. But when they find only the employer, sometimes they find an employer who is ignorant of some of these things. Sometimes they tell them to sign agreements which are far-reaching consequences to employers. So that's one of the things that really happened during this period of COVID-19. Can you go to the next slide? My colleague will talk of the key drivers of social dialogue during COVID-19 because he had started with it. Back to you, Dickens.
Yeah, to trust George to push back the social dialogue issue to me. Another world loves to call me Mr. Social Dialogue. Now, I've been asked to just look at some of the key drivers of social dialogue during the pandemic. And one of them is the Constitution of Kenya 2010. If you look at Article 41, basically the title there is on labor relations. And it is a right for every worker and every employer to form and, and join a union. FKE, is a union, the same way other workers' unions are also there, and they have amalgamated into the central organization of trade union. So the very first key driver to social dialogue is the Constitution of Kenya 2010 at Article 41. And if you look at that article, you'll realize that the attainment of coming together and collectively bargaining is entrenched on negotiation, which is basically arising out of social dialogue. So, as I'd said earlier on, last year and now going forward, the catchphrase has always been on social dialogue, because if you don't do it, then the consequences will be dire. Of course, there are statutory provisions or the legislations that are also key drivers and lead credence on social dialogue, particularly during this time. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 2007 have provisions there that entrenched discussions, and particularly during this pandemic, it is even more important. If you look at the Employment Act, Section 10, subsection 5, the substantive issue there is on consultation. Actually, as I'll be explaining later on, MOU that was signed between the national tripartite partners was simply re-emphasizing the substantive aspect of the constitutional provision, as well as the Section 10 of the Employment Act on consultation. Of course, other drivers would include the social partner instruments that was best demonstrated by FKE, COTU, and the national government under the Ministry of Labor. So even other than that, there can be other instruments, the social partner instruments. Like we are aware that there are enterprises that have entered into their own versions of memoranda of understanding. And of course, when we'll be looking at the MOU strictly, you'll find that such are encouraged, that they're reduced in writing and registered with the Labor Office. Enterprise policies, of course, we are aware that there are members who approached us to help them walk through with certain policies they were trying to put in place during the pandemic, which was very important because you must have an instrument that is able to lead you through these uncertain times. If there are disputes, then of course, there'll be a point of reference in those policies that have been put in place. Of course, those policies included policies touching on the social aspects at the workplace, or the medical aspects at the workplace, and then generally observing some of the national policies that had been put in place, and therefore you customize them to fit into your unique enterprise circumstances. We had court decisions, which Mr. Masese will be looking at later on, and it would be, you'd be surprised that the courts actually understood the dynamics of what was going on, and most of those cases, the courts actually referred parties back to the table to go and talk, because the court realized the importance of social dialogue as a way of resolving not only the disputes that were reported, but potential disputes during the pandemic. At this point, I would wish to just unpack the MOU. The MOU, came as a surprise to many people. In 2019, around November, we all thought that this was just a pandemic ravaging China, Wuhan, if you remember. And for us in Africa, we thought that it was very far away. If you recall, from China, it spread into to its neighbors, then it jumped to Europe. actually Italy had bore the brunt of it. Then from Europe, it went to America, of course, Britain. Then we started having cases in North America, if I can remember. And, you know, come 2020 in January and going to February, I think all antennas were up. For us Kenyans, I think we started realizing, we realized that it was just a matter of time before the first case would be reported here. And sure enough, it was reported. And of course, certain measures had to be put in place administratively. For us in the realm of industrial relations, I think from that time going forward, the MOU, which was signed on the 20th of April 2020, demonstrated that stakeholders can always work together to forge a common destiny. At the same time, we realized that, of course, there were a lot of uncertainties. I do recall that we had to come in most of the time to reassure most of our members that the MOU was supposed to be a guide rather than a blank check, which most of the enterprises wanted to use to take administrative action without consultation, and which was not the case. Conversely, the union thought that they were shortchanged on how the industrial relations is done. But of course, with the time, they also realized that we had to embrace this. So what was some of the truth about the MOU? As I indicated earlier on, the MOU underscored the concept of social dialogue as a way not only to resolve industrial disputes, but also to engage and have a common understanding in the wake of the pandemic going forward. And I want to dwell on this a bit in an unpacking the MOU. You see, the pandemic, to my mind and to students of history, will remind you of what happened during the world wars. And I have in mind a former Prime Minister of Britain, Sir Winston Churchill, who upon the end of the World War and upon the collapse of the League of Nations, a new organization was formed, which was the United Nations Organization. And Sir Winston Churchill said something that was very relevant when you want to look at the MOU and the impact of the pandemic. And this is what he had to say, that the United Nations was not created to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell. I want to relate that to the MOU. The MOU was not signed by the national social partners to take us to heaven, but to save us from the pandemic by putting in place the guidelines that were supposed to be followed if you are to find a common ground to save jobs, but also to save the enterprises from disintegrating. And the MOU, as I said earlier on, was not novel, it was not new. If you look at the concept and substance of the Industrial Relations Charter, it all talks about social dialogue, engagement. If you look at Section 10, subsection 5 of the Employment Act, it talks about reviewing of the terms and conditions of employment through consultation between the employer and the employee. So it was not talking about something new. If you look at Part 8 of the Labor Relations Act, it talks about dispute resolution, reporting at trade dispute. And I'd note that if you look at the entire chapter of the entire sections of the Labor Relations Act, you'll find that dispute resolution comes before adjudication of disputes. adjudication of disputes can only take place in court. And court, at the end of it all, gives judgments, decrees, and orders. In a social setting, if you're subjected to a judgment, a decree, or an order, then it is not cushioning the social dynamics at the workplace. Now you have to comply with a court order. How about if you subject yourselves to negotiations and conciliation, and you arrive at a solution that is agreeable and acceptable to both sides? It will be implemented seamlessly without any hitch. Now, social dialogue at inception, as I said, the employers used it as a carte blanche to, a big stick where they would walk around and, save their business through adverse actions. But through proper understanding, they were able to realize that it was just but a guide. Of course, workers treated it with a lot of suspicion, and we had to come out and say that, look, we either hang together or we hang separately. Matters were not made any better when it was gazetted by the Ministry of Labor. Of course, it brought a lot of hue and cry, because the converse argument was that we have had the Industrial Relations Charter that has been there for nearly 50 years, and it was never, gazetted as a way of making it actionable. And yet it worked well. In fact, all the labor laws find their root, spirit, and breadth from the Industrial Relations Charter. So going forward, if you look at the MOU, you realize that it underscored social dialogue, both resolving industrial disputes and potential disputes. And then it also brought the common understanding. If you look at Part B of the MOU, it was very specific. And number one of Part B was on reporting of those infected and affected by the COVID. And I'm sure if you are very keen in some of our webinars last year, you realize that we were actually talking about putting in place structures to guide the workers during the pandemic. Of course, in line with some of the health protocols that were put in place by the national government. Now, number two of that Part B was also talking about cooperation on data collection, on employment impact assessment, which is very important because the national government had an obligation to know and to understand the trends. And where would they get the trends on infections and the effect on the jobs than from the employers? So that was well captured in the MOU. Number three, and which was very important, and it comes back to what we were talking about, was on social dialogue. It brought into place issues that for a long time we were just dreaming of and we never thought would ever happen. Working from home, and of course it had to involve discussions between the employer and the worker, relying on existing social dialogue channels to build resilience and making commitment to painful but necessary policy measures at the workplace. And of course, those measures included suspensions of negotiations of CBA. And of course, in arriving at such suspension, it required that parties had to talk, had to come to the negotiating table. Suspension of implementation of concluded CBAs. The unions, of course, were quite strict about this. They wanted this to be implemented. But of course, it required the employer to take them through the trajectory and the forecasts on what the impact would have on their enterprises, for them to mellow down and chart a common ground on whether to suspend or not the implementation. Review of the terms of existing CBAs. This was well captured in the MOU. freezing of wage increments. Of course, this was captured, but the underlying issue was that there had to be dialogue between the social partners to realize this. The other aspect, of course, was on planning, implementation and monitoring measures for recovery of COVID. It also talked about the dialogue and engagement, well informed on measures to mitigate the effects of COVID. Mutually agreed terms had to be in writing and they were to be filed with labor offices. Very important so that it becomes a focal point and a reference point should there be dispute arising out of it. And there are instances where the courts even come in and say that if you sat down and actually came to certain agreements and it was signed and filed with the labor officer, then you cannot run away from it. You are bound by it as long as it is a negotiated document. So we are basically talking about mutual agreements that would have employers work on alternate days, reduction of pays, and proceeding on unpaid leaves. These are now policies that faced us squarely, and we had to talk about them and, ensure that their work, they're implemented through the partners. So the long and short of it was that this was intended to ensure job security and, of course, to guarantee enterprise or business continuity. Of course, the various actors had their responsibilities. So that basically is the long and short of the MOU. At this point, I would wish to invite my colleague, Mr. Masese, just to run us through some of the, the cases, just an overview of some of the cases and what the courts thought about the pandemic. Over to you, Mr. Masese.
Right. Thank you so much, Dickens. That was very insightful and well articulated. Now, because of time, allow me to look at the effects on the court decisions, the effects those court decisions during this pandemic period they have had on managerial decisions that we make at workplace. As you are aware, most unions, of course, went to court during this period to protest some of the actions that were being taken by employers. Some of them actually were trying to trash the MOU and saying that maybe the MOU does not apply to them. It was a unilateral decision taken by the COTU Secretary General, and so therefore not binding on them. But for us, all employers were behind the Federation of Kenya Employers by supporting the Federation of Kenya Employers and for taking that initiative, of course, coming up with MOU, which was going to guide parties through this process, as my colleague has said, through the spirit of social dialogue. Now, the courts actually have caused more confusion. They have not provided the proper guidance that we expected. In most jurisdictions, the courts were very consistent. If you look at most of the court decisions from maybe, let's say, South Africa, Australia, and other countries, there was consistency in terms of how they were interpreting the managerial decisions and how they were supporting enterprises. Because at this time they were saying, we need to support more enterprises to remain afloat, because after the COVID, we still need these employees back. But if these enterprises close down, then after the pandemic, of course, again, we are going to throw everybody under poverty. And therefore, they were trying very much to guard against the business. So there was a lot of confusion that was coming from these courts. For example, if I can give you the Kenya Private Universities Workers Union versus, that is, of course, a university. I don't want to name it. The union had gone to court to actually stop the management from implementing certain measures that was going to make that enterprise, that university, continue operating. And when they went to court, of course, they were saying that some of the decisions that were being made by the management were unilateral, and therefore the union was not involved in as much as there was not a collective bargaining agreement between the employer and the union, but there was, of course, a recognition agreement, but parties had not reached a point where they were negotiating a CBA. The court was very categorical, and it said, you go and engage in a negotiation and agree on something that is beneficial to both parties. That is one school of thought from the Employment and Labor Relations Code that we have in Kenya. And for us, that actually added more value to the reason as to why social dialogue should be the key to unlocking all these challenges that the employers were facing, and of course, the employees. And remember that employers during this period, actually, they even extended their support to employees even when they were not working. So the courts were alive to that fact. And they were telling unions, go and talk, meaning that MOU that was signed by the social partners was actually on the table of these judges. Whenever they were making decisions, they were also consulting this MOU. Now, going back again and look at another similar court, but different parties now. This is Kenya Commercial Food and Allied Workers Union versus Tuskys, of course, where it was held that the management should not effect salary reductions. Now, these are two conflicting decisions that were coming from this employment court. So what does that mean to a practitioner in industrial relations? In that you cannot consistently advise your senior management staff, or you cannot really advise the management board in terms of how they make decisions that are affecting the industrial relations in your enterprise. And therefore, you find that, for example, Tuskys, all the problems they have had, it's because, one, the court must realize that by suffocating the employer with some of these kind of orders, it means that the management is not able to make certain decisions that can make this enterprise actually come back to life. And therefore, for me, it's a death sentence that actually prescribing to some of these enterprises. So our quest, can go the next. Our quest has been to this the employment court is that let's have the management have the leeway to make certain decisions first. Then question those decisions after they have been made and if they have affected any party. But the moment the employment court comes into the decision-making process and stops the employer from making that decision or the affecting or stopping that process, for us, and this is what we have discussed in various forums with employment court judges, of course, some of them have come to appreciate what we are saying, is that a decision before it is made, a court does not have a mandate to come and affect that decision-making process. The only mandate the employment court has is actually to wait for the final decision and then let the court examine whether the rights, a person in those circumstances, in his right senses and his right mind, could have reached at the same conclusion that this employer reached. So that is what we are telling the employment court to look at, but not to interfere in the processes of making decisions. And a number of judges have actually come to agree with us that actually in running businesses, I think we are interfering so much into the affairs of managing these businesses, and they have given directives. A few of them, of course, have not changed and have always continued actually to stop the management from the process of making decisions which are good for the company. up to that point, I wish to end it there and say thank you so much, participants. And let me take it back to my colleague, Eric.
Wow, thank you very much, Dickens and Masese. Dickens Ouma, our Senior Industrial Relations Officer, and of course, our Acting Head of Legal and Industrial Relations, Mr. George Masese. Thank you very much for those inputs. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've been monitoring your chats and your questions on the Q&A. So it has reached that point when we want to address those concerns or those questions. Some of them are coming in the form of comments, which is still okay. And my colleagues are going to address them in the next couple of minutes before we close. However, even if you still have a question which you would like to be handled privately, quote and unquote, write to me, and the Federation will give you a response privately, because we realize some people are uncomfortable posting questions here, but you like some answers to some of the issues you are facing at your workplace. So I'll start with Dickens. He has a number of questions which we have picked from the walls, and then we come to Masese George. Dickens, over to you.
Thank you, Eric. I got some few questions here. Edna poses that enlighten more on areas that have changed on various acts. I want to believe those are acts of parliament in line with the new normal. I can tell you that none of the substantive labor acts have been amended or changed to be in line with the new normal. The new normal that we had actually was encapsulated in what was called the force majeure, acts of God. And the conversation that is going on right now is that, is it time we started putting those natural disasters or force majeure into our instruments of engagement, like the CBAs and contracts? So this is a conversation that is going on, but I can tell you that none of the acts was amended to align to the pandemic. What was there was to go back to the social dialogue structures, which are flexible and which work well for various sectors, and to customize them to adapt to our unique circumstances. Francis Ogola asks that how does an organization reduce the number of leave days from 27 to 21, for example, particularly for non-union members? It goes back to what I was talking about, social dialogue. And while we are at it, somebody had a problem with understanding what social dialogue is. In simple language, it simply means that sitting down and talking and agreeing. And not just agreeing, also agreeing to disagree. That is social dialogue. In short, just engage the other side on issues that are common to you and that are common for the enterprise and that are for the benefit of both the employer and the employee. So how does an organization reduce the number of leave days? Just sit down with the employee and engage them. Tell them that it has become difficult to sustain that particular clause, and therefore you want to review it downwards to 21. And that is what section 10, subsection 5 means. Terms and conditions of employment can only be reviewed in consultation with the employee. Edna asked, how do you involve the union on remote working employees on misconduct? Now, first and foremost, the driver on disciplinary administration of disciplinary mechanism lies with the employer. So you must, first of all, put in place policies on dealing with misconduct during the pandemic, and particularly in respect to those employees that are either working from home or are working virtually and all that. So after you put policies, then you will be able to monitor, and therefore if there are any indiscretions, then you are able to take action. You only involve the union when you are putting in place the policies, but when it comes to now taking action, then you are the driver. Stella asked, what is FKE doing about this issue of magistrate courts handling labor matters? It is not in the employer's interest. Now, you did not explain exactly how it is not in the employer's interest, but as my colleague, George Masese had explained earlier on, there was a gazetted notice where the magistrates have jurisdiction to handle cases of employees earning 80,000 shillings and below. Only where it comes to those issues which we classify as individual rights action, where they are seeking to enforce their actions. When it comes to issues of collective bargain or labor issues, collective disputes between the workers and employers, then those are under the preserve of the Employment and Labor Relations Court. Now, what this court did, the case he was giving about Mombasa, was the court basically overreached itself. It went beyond its jurisdiction. Now, it is not for FKE to do something about it. It is for the individual employer to do something about it by challenging that decision. If that employer was a member of the federation, then of course we would advise that this is a bad order and it has to be challenged. And that is when we would come in to represent that particular employer. As a trade union, we really would not go into a case that was already been filed and we make ourselves part and parcel of that decision or of that proceeding. We have, of course, protested to the principal judge, and I hope it is being handled administratively. But you see, legally, when a court order is a court order, whether it is a bad order, but you have to challenge it in the right forum so that you get legal redress out of it. Francis asked what criteria is used in declaring redundancies and what time frame is permissible to do replacements for the same positions. Now, Francis, that is a very mischievous question. Mischievous because it means that the time you are declaring redundancies, already you have focused your mind that after some time you'll want to bring these people back. Now, that is an unfair labor practice, and if it turns out that you actually did it for short-term gain, then you will be in trouble. But the criteria used in declaring redundancies during the pandemic period has not changed. That is in the law. You have to follow the law. And what I would encourage our members is that do not wait until it is too late before you declare people redundant. Those are decisions that you have to make within the, within the right time so that it is executed. And at the end of it all, you still remain afloat. We've noticed or we've come across instances where we are advised on the process of redundancies, and after the advice has been given, then you realize, or the member realizes that as soon as that is done, then things are thick. There is no money to pay the redundancy terminal benefits. So Francis, you have to be very careful. If you are declaring people redundant, I believe it would be a good labor practice to ensure that if you have to do replacements, and a replacement is not a good word here, if you have to fill those positions, then certainly give priority to those whom you had declared redundant, because remember, you had taken time to train them in those positions, and it would be good that they come for purposes of continuity to go on with those tasks in your enterprises. I think those are the only questions that I've been able to get right now. Of course, Jacob had indicated that many organizations signed collective bargaining agreements in year 2020 with average of 6 to 8%. Is it possible for FKE to convince union to settle for 0% for incoming CBS in the year 2021? It goes back to social dialogue. Just tell the union that, if we do not settle for 0, we are done. There's something I need to tell our members. When you're going for negotiations, do not think that you are the only person under pressure. Even the unions are under pressure because they normally make one mistake. They make promises. And some of those promises may not be achieved. Or some of those promises may have very adverse consequences and will backfire on them. Because how about if you tell a union that, look, we cannot do the 6 to 8%. If you insist that we do it, you can be sure that in the next 4 months, we'll have to lay off some people. It will put pressure on them. So you are not the only people under pressure. The pressure is all over. But that is the beauty of sitting down to talk. Mr. Masese.
Thank you very much, Dickens. I think for me, I have 2 questions. In fact, the third one I think has been answered by my colleague Dickens. It's about elaborating the concept of social dialogue. One of the participants is saying she doesn't understand really the concept of social dialogue. I don't want to repeat, but as Dickens has said, very simple, is the exchange of information. It's a negotiation, it's a consultation process. Section 10.5 of the Employment Act is actually the foundation of social dialogue in employment law. And this, of course, encompasses, when you talk of social dialogue, it encompasses, of course, employers, employees, and the unions. Where there are no unions, of course, individual employees, you can talk to them. So that is basically social dialogue. And some of the instruments of collective bargaining agreements come there and all that. So that is, in a nutshell, what we understand by social dialogue. Okay, let me go back to Noel Owor. Noel has asked a very good question. Please elaborate more on the gig economy and its negative effect on IR. Noel, I want to start by saying that as we speak, there's no legal framework that is actually in place to guide employers and the union and the employees, or rather even COTU the way it is starting to raise this issue, this alarm of the gig economy and all that. There's no legal framework in Kenya as we speak. And if the statistics in the world is that the young people, 30 to maybe 40% around the world are in fact in the gig economy. And so it is actually an economy that is growing very fast. So it requires a legal framework for us to move forward. And I've said earlier, the Uber has been a classic example in the UK where they have moved in to challenge and say, look, we are employees and they're not independent contractors. So most of these gig economy, these are independent contractors. And in industrial relations, we know how we deal with independent contractors. These are not our employees. We don't pay them salaries at the end of the month. We don't pay for them payee. We don't have insurance cover for them because when they come, we tell them, come with your insurance cover. Mostly, if I take you, if I give you a good example, is the one of the media and the newspapers. We have correspondents. These correspondents, when they write, I've seen 2-3 cases where they have gone to court, challenge and say, actually we're employees because we were reporting to duty on this particular day and we used to receive our money at the end of the month and all that. But then the nitty-gritty is who controls you? I mean, the employer does not control you the way you do your job. I mean, by coming to work in the morning and reporting to my place of work in the morning and I have no control over you completely, doesn't make you my direct employee. So, and then why employers are actually liking some of this kind of arrangement is because of the staffing aspects and also the market forces. If you have to make a profit, then you have to think twice on the kind of, or the model of employment relationship that you need to have, as long as it does not violate employees' rights, but you balance the interest of the person who is earning from you and also you as an enterprise, because you want to progress, employ more, create more jobs for people. And of course, as an enterprise, it's not a charitable organization. You also need to make profit and expand. So some of these competing interests in the market demand for staffing and all that are the ones that are making, for example, right now, the gig economy in Kenya, it is because of maybe that lack of legal framework. That is why we have this kind of arrangement. But of course, as long as the rights of these employees, this decent work agenda, which is very key, and it's being observed, I have no problem completely with engaging employees in this kind of model. The other question was, of course, from another participant called Ruth, who says, will it be mutually beneficial for employers to join a union as a group or as a private citizen? Employees, they join the unions individually. They don't join as a group. The only question is, if you have more than 5 employees, because that's what the law says, then a union can come in and they has recruited all of them, then the union can come in and seek recognition with you. If you have less than 5, then the union cannot really cause a request for recognition. For example, if you talk of domestic workers, and I think this is a topic that we are very soon having a conversation on, domestic workers, and of course understanding the balancing act, the employers, of course, everybody I think is an employer because you have somebody working for you at home. The challenge with the union is that they cannot come to you and recruit because, one, you are not registered as an employer. Secondly, you have only maybe 1 or 2 people. So unless now the law changes, and then it is like, even if you have 1 employee, the union can come in and of course seek recognition with you. Then you start now negotiate. I don't know how you're going to negotiate that CBA for that 1 employee that you have at workplace. So for this one, you don't necessarily have to join as a group or join as you join as an individual. As a union, you join as an individual. The same way as an employer, when you join an association or a group, you join as an individual employer. And then from there now, you are able to collectively negotiate as a group. And of course, you know what that means is that you strengthen your bargaining power on the table. The reason as to why employees go into the unions is because they want to strengthen their bargaining power. The same way you come to FKE to strengthen your bargaining power, of course, with the unions. The other question was, no, I don't think I have another question. I think up to that point, I'll ask Ouma maybe at the end of this, before he leaves, to tell us exactly what would be the implication of gazetting the MOU. Then to that extent, does that MOU lose that social aspect and become a legal document? And then with the Industrial Relations Charter, whether they send relevance between the Industrial Relations Charter and the gazettement of the MOU and the impact that gazettement has in terms of how we are moving forward in industrial relations. Omar, back to you.
You know, in my presentation, I said that those questions arose, and you know, a student of industrial relations, you know, you'll ask yourself that if the Industrial Relations Charter has been with us for nearly 50 years, and it was never gazetted, and it has served us so well, in fact, it is a point of reference even in the legislation of our labor laws, then it follows that gazetting the MOU becomes inconsequential. In fact, a good student and a believer of industrial relations will not want to hang on to the MOU as a legal instrument. It is persuasive. It's supposed to put order at the workplace. It's supposed to put order in the engagement of the industrial relations actors. That's how I would want to look at it. Somebody was raising their hand, and I'm trying to figure out.
Yes, indeed, we encourage live questions. So you can raise your hand. We are seeing you, as well as we are reading your questions in the chat box and the Q&A. So we have Ndorobo Ngania. Ndorobo Ngania, can you hear us?
Oh, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that good presentation and eye-opening. I have, I think, 2-3 brief questions. Taking cognizance of the fact that FK is actually the national umbrella and the voice of employers. And given the fact that its mandate is promote interests of employers, I would just like to ask on question number 1, we have talked about the working hours, how the new norm has actually affected our working hours. And my question goes to the female employees, as you rightly put, that are part of the team that has really been affected. You as a FKE have acceptable standards on how to treat expectant mothers, given that number 1, it is, being expectant is not taken as a disease. It is not an underlying condition. But given that, like for us as organizations, I think we've just tried to check on the best practices. And I think UK takes 22 months to be a period where you can give special interest to expectant mothers. But I'd just like to know from you as a body, are there any acceptable standards that you've come up with that you would actually advise employers to take into consideration? That's number 1. Number 2 is on the freeze on the minimum wage. As we are all aware, of course, the government has frozen that. But with the new norm, we've had a few challenges, and one of the things is hygiene, which is enhanced, that actually requires emphasis. So my question would be, for example, in the cleaning services, you find that because of this, they have based their minimum wage on what we had before. But given the fact that we have at some point even reviewed contracts, for instance, just to incorporate the question of deep cleaning to ensure that the work environment is conducive to all employers and employees. My question is from the FKE bit, is there a way, or can it be within your mandate to beseech on the government just to review this? Because, well, companies are also not reviewing the salaries of their employees based on that fact of the freeze on minimum wage, even after employers or other organizations have reviewed, so to speak, their terms in terms of their contracts, given that wider scope. My final question is on these decisions. As my friend Dickens have actually rightly put it, yes, the onus is on that specific organization. But as FKE, have you gone over and above just so that we assist all other organizations or other employers, given that we now have 2 conflicting decisions? What has FKE done, like in, do you do questions like, okay, issues like joining in or beseeching this specific whatever to take on an appeal so that we have a settled decision that will guide all the employers? Finally, it's not a question, but a comment that could FKE also consider just a robust or really be proactive in creating awareness, having regular awarenesses to most organizations, especially the management, to advise your members on all these emerging issues other than the training that you are doing currently? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ndorobo from Kengen. Asante sana. I'll take on the last one. Yes, we frequently do sensitization programs which are free, and we call these webinars. So be on the lookout. We have the webinars monthly. Last year we did quite a number of them, and they are still on course. So those are available, and we shall be sending this out in our regular e-shots, and your management and all your staff can join in. So back to your 3 questions. I'll throw them back to the team, starting with the George. And for your information, our executive director has rejoined us. She's also an expert in these things. and she could also jump in. But George, you want to? Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for those very nice questions. So of course, the first one is about vulnerable employees. Vulnerable employees, of course, we classify them into various categories. Pregnant women are part of the vulnerable group at workplaces during this COVID period. And of course, FKE has done a lot of, has developed a lot of tools, I mean, so many tools. And these have helped companies, of course, to manage the crisis. When the crisis came up, we had almost like 3 or 4 instruments which went out to employers to guide them on how to go around this crisis, COVID-19. And our emphasis, of course, we discussed about the vulnerable employees at workplaces. During our first webinars, we actually discussed about vulnerable employees. We also had a discussion on the convention on violence at workplaces and all that. So all these aspects that we were discussing, basically, were targeting the aspect of vulnerable employees and how we handle these vulnerable employees. The Ministry of Labor, through the Director of Occupational Safety and Health, has also given guidelines on how to treat these vulnerable employees, and more so, not only the pregnant women, but also those who have conditions at workplaces. You go for a free medical checkup, and if you have a condition, of course, you have to tell you inform your employer, and then from there, yes, and then from there, the employer can take the necessary steps, of course, as per the guidelines given by the Ministry of Health and also the Director of Occupational Safety and Health. I think my boss will talk on the issue of the government freezing of a minimum wage, or maybe renegotiating down of the minimum wage. Of course, this is a tall order, of course, to ask the government to do that. But of course, as you are aware, the MOU, of course, which again, she's the one who led the team and the whole country into that signing of the MOU, is that it has actually it has provided solutions other than now what we can see as a problem of freezing, maybe, or reducing or negotiating downwards the minimum wage. So for me, that MOU is enough to actually provide a solution to the freeze of minimum wage, or the concern on the freeze of minimum wage. On the issue of court decisions, we pick court decisions that we have handled ourselves at the Federation, and whenever there's a conflict, we always go to the Court of Appeal. We have like 5 cases and the Court of Appeal right now touching on various aspects. For example, I can share with you on the aspect of Section 54 of the labor relations. How can a union be granted a recognition by an employer who is already in a group or in an association? And therefore, what are the rights of this employer? And these are the things that have been going on, various unions, of course, coming in and fighting and all that. These cases we have taken to the Court of Appeal. We have like a range of 5 that we have at the Court of Appeal right now, and the Federation is handling them. So for those that we didn't handle from the word go, we usually talk to our members. For example, there were decisions that was given against one of the outsourcing companies, and that judgment, of course, we challenged it. First, we went to a review because we were late to file the appeal. So we started again from a review. When we talked to the employer said, okay, I think it's better I come to you, you assist me in terms of handling this one. For us, it's not about only that employer. For us, it's about the principle. How do we run, how are we going to run this market? How do we go to labor market? So the federation is not concerned about that one individual person, but because that one individual person is the one setting an example to the rest of the labor sector. So we pick those cases up as and when the employers bring them to us, and we advise them and they give us instructions. We take instructions and we pursue them. We cannot pursue a case that maybe an employer is not satisfied or maybe doesn't want to pursue further. Thank you. I'll invite my executive director maybe to say something on the freeze of minimum wage and maybe comment on the vulnerable employees.
Thank you, George. I've been listening into your class and the interventions, and I think you've had a very interactive session. This could be controversial, but I've never thought that pregnant ladies are vulnerable people because they're very strong ladies, but of course you're prone to, one never knows what may unfold. And the concerns that were shared about what FKE has done and George has really responded to exhaustively. I was listening in and thinking, so I've had all my kids when I was working, and for sure women would like to stay home longer than the 3 months that is currently provided for. Previously, you all know it was shorter than that. It was just 2 months, and you had to forfeit your annual leave. So now women don't have to forfeit the annual leave, and they have 3 months, which is still not enough, but it's double what used to be there before. It's always a question of what can the economy afford, and at what level do you peg some of these benefits that would then not discriminate or reduce the competitiveness of women in the labor market. The law just sets the minimum. The fact that the law says that a woman is entitled to 3 months maternity leave and also her annual leave doesn't mean an employer, especially those in the NGO world, cannot give you longer than what the law says. But that's the minimum which you should have. And yes, as George has said, we raised a lot of awareness on these issues. The sexual harassment and violence at work, the discrimination, but also from a positive angle, just developing women and persons living with disabilities, looking at youth. All these things are areas where I think Kenya has made a lot of strides in opening up spaces, but there's still a lot that could be done. We do have acceptable standards of what should happen at workplaces. So we do training to our members on what the laws say, but beyond that, we help you develop policies and give you a view of what's happening in the developed economies to compare with the best in the world. Because as you know, our vision is really to be the best in class as an employers organization. And so we want workplaces that are free from harassment, workplaces that are inclusive, workplaces where both the young and old can work, and workplaces that focus on bringing out the best in people. And this is even more urgent now with this COVID-19. I think in the last 2-3 years, we've done a lot to make it possible for women, young mothers especially, to be at work. They have lactation rooms, which a lot of employers have put in place, even FKE has one, so that young mothers can still work and also perhaps be able to go home, be able to nurse their children in workplaces. So the barrier between the workplace and home, I think, is getting a little fuzzy, but it's very important that young mothers be allowed to work without worrying about the condition of their children. On minimum wages, as George says, I think it would be an uphill task to request the government to lower the minimum wage, which you know is quite low, to be honest. In surveys that we've done with members, hardly any of our members are on the minimum wage. They're way above the minimum wage. The minimum wage is an entry point. And it's only employers who perhaps pay a daily rate or have casual workers that will then look at the minimum wage. But we have some flexibility with the MOU that was signed, and also with the employers having a little more latitude during these difficult times that we're all going through to figure out what are the minimum numbers of staff that you need. The freeze on wages was a reality. I mean, we couldn't look at any increments, and we hope that even this year, Labor Day would not be about increasing the minimum wage, but increasing the cost of employment, particularly for those who've been in employment for a long time, and the push from unions to have salary increments is what I think puts more employers at risk of having a level of pay that you cannot sustain. And we continue to appeal to the unions through the social dialogue that we're talking about to maintain stability so that those who are still in jobs can be retained. And we then become very flexible as social partners in knowing how to manage staff issues. I think George has responded about whether or not we have appealed against some of these rulings. Yes, we have, but we do so on instruction. Unless it's a matter of common interest, sometimes we'll come to members to make some contribution towards a court matter, perhaps if you're seeking an injunction against some proposed increments, such as we did in the housing levy matter. We have been very proactive, actually, in advising members. We do that on a daily basis. The members of the Federation can contact us on a daily basis, individually, through phone, through our website, and we respond to their questions as individuals, if they have them, or we do webinars on various topics. And listening into the class, some of the recurrent topics, which I think we should handle in a deep dive session, perhaps in a webinar or a class, are social dialogue. What is social dialogue? How does it work? What does it entail? What are the international instruments that govern it? I think we had thought that this is an area we'd covered, but perhaps we can look at it in greater depth, George and Dickens, going forward. The other one is management of redundancies. What does the law say? What are the employer's obligations and rights? How do you go about it? I think that's one of the areas, again, that we may want to consider to look into. There were a number of questions about terms and conditions of service, renegotiating collective bargaining agreements, or how do you engage employees on the lowering of salaries, working on shifts. These are all aspects that are provided in terms of options under the Memorandum of Understanding. Depending on the issues you're actually grappling with as an enterprise, you can pretty much engage the union with our advice, of course, on areas where you want review. And as far as we know, they have been quite accommodating. A few years have had problems, but on the whole, I think unions continue to understand. The gig economy has been responded to, and we're very happy that you're interested in knowing this and the new patterns, even of unionization and union representation. And there were questions about, can you join a union individually? Yes, you always join a union individually, but the key issue is that union recognized? Does the enterprise, does the employer have to recognize that union and give them the right to represent your employees? For that to happen, you need a certain threshold of employees who have been recruited by this union, and that is 51%. As long as they haven't met that threshold, yes, individual employees can be union members. The Constitution allows that, but for you to engage with them on a legal, formal basis as an employer, the union has to meet that threshold. There are lots of legal issues that will continue to arise around the contracts of employment, how to manage them, and how to engage unions where you need to review certain aspects. And that, I think, is an ongoing conversation because there are very many different permutations of the challenges and the problems that employers have. So please feel free to engage us, engage George, engage Dickens, engage any of the members of our legal and industrial relations team. As you know, we also have regional branch offices in Nakuru, in Kisumu, in Mombasa, and you can also reach those officers. Should the problem be one that is recurrent and is widespread, then we will address it as a webinar or as a class. So we look forward to you giving us ideas on other topics that you'd want us to handle for you. So it is my pleasure to thank you all very much for your participation and for for joining this class. I don't know if, Eric, you've done the assessment? Or should I close?
Yes, we shall do the assessment module 3.
Okay, so you're not doing it today?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we do the second module, which we had already talked about. Thank you very much for joining this class. And thank you to George and Dickens and Eric for taking us through this class. Have a wonderful day. It's goodbye for now. See you.
I'm sorry to come back after my CEO, but I wanted just to announce that we shall be sending you a second link for tomorrow. So we shall send a second this afternoon, second link, and I do hope you will check it out so that we avoid last minute. So by tomorrow morning, you are comfortable and cozy to start the course. And keep posting the questions as our CEO has said, and they'll be answered too. Thank you very much.
Tunasherehekea uhusiano wetu, mashirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherehekea uhusiano wetu, mashirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherehekea uhusiano wetu, mashirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasherehekea uhusiano wetu, mashirikisho yetu, sauti ya waajiri wetu. Tunasema